Ah, So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming to this session. Uh, I've been uh, enjoying myself, uh, going out to Taos virtually uh, has been very, very pleasant. And what I want to do today, at least start off today, by uh, reviewing very briefly the approach that we've been taking so far. The main focus has been on the practice of offering. And within the practice of offering, um, we've started to talk about the 7 water bowl offerings. And the material that we're going to go over today is going to be more about that, but from some different viewpoints. But, you know, there is a kind of question that can come up when we spend time looking at what are, in fact, sensory objects of desire. I'll repeat that phrase, sensory objects of desire, because these various offerings are all things that appeal to our sight, our hearing, our smell, our taste, and our touch, right? A beautiful flower, fragrant incense, things like that, okay? And they play a very significant role in pretty much every single practice that I've ever been introduced to in the field of Mahayana Buddhism, especially as practiced among the Tibetans, but not exclusive to them. Everything within the Mahayana sphere of teachings, whether it's the general sphere of the sutra teachings or the more concentrated esoteric teachings of Tantra. In every one of those that I've come across, there is some place, usually very close to the beginning of the practice, in which they invoke what's known as the 7 limbs of practice, the 7 limbs of practice. Sometimes it's called the 7-limb puja, for example. So can I see by a raise of hands how many people are somewhat familiar of running across practices that concentrate, or at least begin with, these 7 limbs of practice? So I think I see everyone. Oops. Bill and Patty, are you familiar with those teachings on the 7 limb, or at least the presence of those?
It's familiar. I mean, the name is, but I'm not familiar with the practice really. I know but I was probably been through it at one point, but I don't remember what it entails.
Okay, well, we'll go over that, and to bring us up to speed. I'm getting some messages on my screen that I don't fully understand. But I also just got a very, very beautiful picture of what looks like Lama Tsongkhapa. John, did you put that up there? It suddenly appeared a very beautiful statue of Lama Tsongkhapa. Maybe I'm having a religious experience right here in front of everyone. No, it must have come from my laptop somehow. Anyway, I want to start off by by just probing some questions. This is this is not an examination, so don't feel nervous about it. I just want to see if we can provide a background, because there's something related to these practices that is quite different. One might even say foreign to the spirit of Buddhist practice. So why something that can look so different, so foreign to the practice, has a integral role right in the very center of the practice? That's something interesting to explore, I think. Okay. And of course, before we get into any discussion like that, we should, as always, try to cultivate a motivation for being present in this session. So whatever it is that we think or say or experience is not just for our own private intellectual benefit, but is to help us move along the path towards awakening, a state in which we can be of maximum benefit to others. So any practice that we do that leaves out being concerned about the benefit of others is not a Mahayana practice. So it's very important that we generate that thought in the beginning. Okay. So I'll ask a few questions, and if you feel confident about giving some answer, and don't worry if you're not sure it's the right answer or not, you can raise your hand or indicate somehow. And John, would it be best for you to call the person's name, or I'm not quite sure how this works. Like if someone had a question or a comment.
They would need to unmute themselves, but there's also a raised hand feature that people could use. And I believe that puts them up at the top of the list.
Okay.
So whichever anybody prefers.
People know how to access the raised hand feature. I believe it's on the bottom of the screen under More, perhaps.
Under reactions.
And on my screen, reaction.
If you click on it, it'll give you some choices.
Oh, yeah. Under More at the bottom is reactions. Oh, very good. Thank you. Okay. So it has sometimes been said in quoting Shakyamuni Buddha, there was a statement he made when he was teaching. He said, I only teach two things. I only teach two things: suffering and the overcoming of suffering. Suffering and the cessation of suffering. Have you heard that quotation before? No, of course, that if we just limit it to those two statements, of course, it doesn't explicitly mention a whole other aspect of the Buddhist teachings, right? For example, we know that compassion and so forth plays an enormous role in the Buddhist teachings, but compassion isn't mentioned specifically when you talk about suffering and the overcoming of suffering. Right? If you explore more deeply, then compassion comes in. But just reducing all of Buddha's teachings just to those two words, teaching the existence of suffering and the cessation of suffering, it needs quite a bit of commentary to realize how all the Buddhist teachings, they talk about the 84,000 teachings of the Buddha, how all of them can be understood within that framework. But when you were beginning to study Buddhism, or still reading about it now, what do they often say in our general experience leads to suffering, leads to dissatisfaction, leads to uneasiness. What in our everyday experience, through our senses, through what we see, through what we hear, through what we smell, through what we taste, through what we touch, and our sixth sense, through what we think about or feel or have emotions about. In relation to those objects of those senses, what is conducive to suffering? What creates dis-ease or discomfort in relationship to the objects of our senses? And if that's too vague a question, then just reduce it to one sense, like the sense of taste. Okay, so every day we eat several times, maybe quite a bit more than several times, if you're like me. Okay, so why is tasting food, right, the object of the sense of taste, in what respect is tasting of food, how could that be understood as leading to suffering, dissatisfaction? From your own experience. Yes.
Sarah,
Yeah, Sarah.
is it attachment?
Attachment, right? That it really comes down to attachment, right? Because there seems to be different ways of eating. I remember being introduced to the phrase, instead of eating to live, I'm living to eat, right? So we all, as long as we have this body, we all have to eat in order to live. But some people's lives, and many people's lives at different times, are oriented in order to eat. In other words, the living is just a way of getting more to eat rather than eating a way of staying alive. So what does that indicate? What does that mean about our attitude towards objects of taste? What would be the difference between a way of relating to food, for example, that doesn't create suffering, and a way but that enhances our life, as opposed to a way of relating to it that creates dissatisfaction? Yes. Yes, Mary Jo.
It seems to me like if we could have always an idea of gratitude when we were eating, then it would be more easy, it would be better. We wouldn't have so many negatives, like sometimes we get attached to the idea of what we think it should taste like. And then if it does not reach that idea, then we're disappointed and we do not care for it.
I think that's very profound. Often we have an object in front of us, like food, for example, but what we're actually eating in terms of our psychological experience is an idea we have about what the food should be. Not what it actually is, but a mental image in our mind. It should taste like this. I want it to be like this. So if you eat something, and it might be nourishing and it might be good tasting, but if it doesn't accord with our preconceived notion of what we were going to have, then instead of finding delight in what we're eating, we find this not only dissatisfaction, but a sense of dis-ease and discomfort. Does that make sense? What else? So
Hello? It's Patty. Patty, can you hear me?
yes, I do. I can't always see at the same time. I see you now.
Okay. Well, do any of you remember a play that was called The Fantastics?
I remember it used to play, yeah.
Yeah. And after the break, the first thing that happens is that the kids are sitting with their fathers and they're eating plums. And the girl says, "This plum is too ripe." And the whole show changes.
But that was like a sign of her dissatisfaction.
Well, up until then, it had been very happy and positive, and everybody loved everybody. And after the halftime, that's the first words that were said. And the whole thing goes into a negative place. And I just thought that was a good example of that. This plum is too ripe. And the other person answers, "Sorry."
It snowballs after that.
Well, yeah, it all goes wrong.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah.
Any other viewpoint about this question of our relation to sensory objects of desire? Yes. Sorry. Yes, Sarah.
Yeah, well, even though they may be good initially, if we overindulge in something, it turns into something unsatisfactory. Something good can easily go south on us and become less satisfactory. The overindulgence.
Another quotation, a very famous quotation by the Buddha himself, and it uses this phrase that I've repeated a few times: sensory object of desire. So sensory object means any of the objects of our 5 physical or 1 mental sense. So they're sensory objects, right? And they're sensory objects of desire because our relationship to them is desiring to experience them. We wish to experience a beautiful looking visual images, pleasant sounds, very nice tastes, gentle touches, tangible sensations, and the like. So it's in relationship to those sensory objects of desire that a certain amount of dissatisfaction is almost built into it right from the beginning. Because first of all, if the sensory object of desire is not pleasing, we dislike that. And if it is pleasing, then as was just pointed out, how long does that pleasant experience stay pleasant? If you, as a child and pretty much as an adult as well, I was addicted to ice cream. And when I have the first spoonful of ice cream, that's really delicious. Oh, and the second one's not bad either. The third one, well, it's not up to snuff. And by the time I reach the 4th or the 5th one, I don't even want to look at ice cream anymore. So it's not as if the taste of the ice cream changed, but the attitude towards it had a certain built-in expiry date. expiration date. The more you repeat it, the less pleasure it gives. And as was just mentioned, after a certain point, it not only ceases to give pleasure, but it changes into its opposite, to pain or dissatisfaction. Is that something that you can verify as true from your experience or not? You know, I always like the example of kids at a party, a birthday party, faced with this chocolate cake with all the icing on it, and it looks like a completely attractive sensory object of desire. But if you go into those parties afterwards and you look at the plates that are left behind, almost all of that sweet stuff is left. Even the kids can't eat it all. Right? So what appears to be so attractive upon actual experience is cloying. It's too much. So one of the things that Buddha said was running after sensory objects of desire. Running after sensory objects of desire is like drinking, well, maybe you know the end of the quotation. It's like drinking what? Is anyone familiar with this quotation? Running after sensory objects of desire is like drinking salt water. Instead of quenching your thirst, it only increases your thirst. Running after sensory objects of desire is like drinking salt water. So like if you're thirsty and you happen to be near the ocean, you see all that water, well, that'll quench my thirst. If you actually were to drink any of the salt water, instead of quenching your thirst, it just makes you more thirsty. It's very different from drinking fresh water. Okay. So Buddha said, this is the syndrome of running after sensory objects of desire. In other words, running after them meaning grasping, being attached to them, wanting more from them than they can give. So before I continue, does this make sense? You know, for example, the fact that Buddha said something, the fact that our teachers for the last 2,000 years have been saying something, does not make it true. Does not make it true. Buddha wanted us to check from our own experience. You know, do we find that when we're obsessive about some object of desire, a sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, or mental object, that when we obsess about it, that sooner or later it leads to dissatisfaction? Or is it always pleasant? If the object starts out as being pleasant, is it always pleasant? And we have to, if we don't check that against our own experience, then the whole meaning, the whole import of this is kind of lost on us. And Buddha never wanted us to accept anything that he said as true, just simply because he said it. It was meant to be something to think about, to experience, to reflect about. Okay. So why am I bringing all of this up? Right? Because all of this is within the context of setting up a shrine or an altar. You know, if we're in a Dharma center, then there's usually a raised platform in the front, and all sorts of beautiful things are placed on it, like flowers and incense and things like that, right? And if we're in our own home and there's a meditation area that we've set aside, maybe a corner of our bedroom or maybe another room that we have, someplace up in the attic, and that's the area that we go to meditate, to think about and study the Dharma and so forth, then typically we arrange that area, you know, like an altar or a shrine, and put on it images of our gurus and our teachers, right? and place in front of those images objects which we deem to be beautiful, attractive. So doesn't there seem to be something somehow or other backwards about a teaching which emphasizes that our attachment to sensory objects of desire are a cause of frustration, and yet setting up our meditation spot to be as attractive as possible? Because when we set up something as attractive as possible, let's say the flowers we put on, we don't put on a flower that we don't like. We put it on a flower that we find desirable. Or if we're going to light a stick of incense, we don't want to light a stick of incense that smells terrible to us. We put on something that appeals to our sense of smell. Isn't that true? Do you ever put rotten eggs on the altar in front of the Buddhas? Probably nobody does that. Though there is an interesting story, and if I remember it at the end, I'll try to tell, but somebody will have to remind me, give me a clue, because otherwise I'll never get back to this. I always derail my train of thought. So, but before I derail it, it's like, how do we understand the presence in our meditation environment of things which are meant to be attractive, with the dangers of being attracted to sensory objects of desire? Now, one of the earlier statements that were made, but I'm sorry, I can't remember which one of you said it, gave a hint in that direction. But what do you think? How can we understand? Or is there, in your mind, no contradiction between putting beautiful objects up on the altar and then engaging in a meditation in a subject matter which is warning us against being attracted or addicted to these objects of desire?
Well, I think we're intending to transform them. This is Eloise. Transform these objects as objects to be enjoyed, and transforming it is that it, perhaps understanding the emptiness of the objects that we're offering.
Yes, that's very, very much in the direction of addressing this paradox, let's say, that we recognize that the problem is not in the object itself, but that our attitude needs an attitude adjustment. And we adjust the attitude. One of the higher practices is to transform what we see. That's actually getting closer to the practice of Tantra. Right? So it's a more advanced practice, but we can practice it on many different levels. Right? So one is to transform it, and I'll get back to some of the phrases you used to talk about transforming in a second. But another, and this relates to that comment that was made earlier, but as I said, I couldn't remember who made it. It was, if when we're facing something that's interesting or attractive, our whole force field is taking it to ourself, grasping it for ourselves, holding on to it for my pleasure. That attitude, that I, me, mine attitude, can turn something that's very attractive into a burden, into something that's, problematic. So one of the ways of changing that is when there's a beautiful object, you can recognize that it's beautiful. And then instead of focusing on my experience of it being beautiful, share that experience with others or give it away to others. And when we set up an altar with beautiful objects, we're kind of, in a certain way, on a certain level of practice, we're kind of acknowledging my own experience with sensory objects of desire is problematic. But for an enlightened being like you, Buddha, these are no problems at all. These are just things that further increase your bliss and wisdom. So you place things on the altar and you give them up. So things that would cause grasping and dissatisfaction, from looked at from another point of view, just brings happiness, the happiness of sharing it with others, of giving it away to others, or presenting it in front of the enlightened senses of a Buddha, for example. So that is part of the process of transformation, isn't it? So very much what's involved in these practices is looking at our experience from a point of view that isn't totally egocentric. Either we're presenting these objects to the enlightened beings from whom we're going to receive a direction and inspiration, or we're sharing it with other beings, or we're seeing them as if we're looking at all these objects under an electron microscope. Because anything that looks really attractive, if we look at it really, 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 really closely, it just becomes like little atoms, little grains of sand. Like when you see a photograph in a newspaper, maybe it's a photograph of a very handsome Hollywood star or a beautiful actress, let's say. There's a very attractive picture of this man or this woman on the photograph, and when you look at it, you say, "Oh, that's a very attractive looking person." What happens when you blow up that picture? After a while, you don't even see the image anymore. All you see is, especially if you're on a computer screen, you just see pixels. You just see little dots. And the original image that you see disappears because it's just built on this network of dots. Do you know that experience? Actually, the internet is very, very good for this because you can take a still picture of anything that you see and then just enlarge it, enlarge it, enlarge it. And after a while, it ceases to be an object of attraction. That's almost like looking into its empty nature. Not exactly equivalent, but it's certainly in that field of experience, is that the picture that we're seeing in our mind's eye is not actually what the object is made of. Instead, we are looking at our own constructed mental image. So the practice of making offerings is very much a practice. You can call it transformation. You can call it a practice of giving, generosity. The first of the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva is the practice of giving or generosity. Because things that are problematic when we hold on to them no longer create problems for our mind when we give them away. Especially when we give them away with the thought, may this bring peace and happiness to someone else. And that very thought itself brings peace and happiness to ourselves. And then if we become a little bit familiar with certain processes of tantric purification, and we can think, oh, this object, which just brings ordinary pleasure to myself, is bringing a blissful experience, enhancing the blissful experience of enlightenment for holy beings. If we bring that to mind, then just thinking that way creates a certain bliss in our own mind. If we imagine our teacher becoming blissfully happy because we just gave him or her some sensory object of desire and they found it delightful, right? If we imagine the delight that the teacher has experienced, just our imagination of it gives us a portion of that blissful experience. Does that make sense? So instead of approaching these objects with a very narrow, tight, grasping attitude, the more we can open up and give and share and transform, then there's no problem with the sensory objects of desire. But it's a continual process, isn't it? Because if we had habit, well, we could say from beginning of lifetimes, or we can just say from the time we were very little, we've had the habit of grasping onto things that we find pleasant, right? Then even when we're in the midst of doing a spiritual or so-called religious practice, that attitude can kick in. We can revert to it. So we need to be vigilant about what's going on in the mind. And I just want to tell the story that I was thinking of before, but I didn't want to lose my train of thought completely. Have you ever heard stories about the Tibetan meditator named Ben Kungel? He lived about 1,000 years ago. Ben Kungel. Does that name mean anything to anyone here? He was a practitioner who he actually started out as a criminal, and he was very, very kind of rough. He was like a highwayman. He robbed people as they passed back and forth on the Tibetan plateau. But he had experience in his life that changed it very much. And so he became a practitioner. And the way he practiced was so immediate, so straightforward, that other great meditators praised the way Ben Kungel practiced. So it happened on one occasion that Ben Kungel was meditating he had a kind of like a cave or a shrine room somewhere. And he found out that on this particular day, his patron was coming to visit. So that day, when he set up his shrine, he thought, "Oh, I should make things extra special, beautiful today, because the patron is supporting my practice, and I want to show him, how beautiful I can make things. That I'm not a nothing practitioner. I can really put together a beautiful looking shrine." So he did that. He laid out many more offerings than he usually did. He tidied things up more carefully than he usually did. He tried to make the whole shrine room look as beautiful and as attractive as possible. And then he sat down to do his meditation. And in his meditation, in the beginning, as we all know, one of the first things we do is to check our motivation. So he was sitting there in front of this altar, and he looked at it and looked so attractive, but it wasn't the way he normally set it up. And he realized he was doing that just to impress his patron. And he realized that the entire offering was polluted by this attitude of wanting his reputation to be better, to get more favors from his patron and so forth, which had nothing to do with spiritual practice. So when he realized that, he reached into the fireplace where there was some ashes on the bottom, and he picked up a handful of ashes and he threw it all over his altar, all over the shrine room. Everything that he had made so beautiful looking now was completely covered with ash and dust. And at that time he said, I throw these ashes in the face of all worldly concerns. I throw them into the face of all worldly concerns. Now, at that same moment in Tibet, in another area of Tibet, there was a great meditator from India named Padampa Sangye, who figures prominently in stories of Machak Labdrome and Milarepa and other great practitioners of the day. And Padampa Sangye was a psychic practitioner of that type. So Padampa Sangye, even though he was miles and miles away, he saw everything that happened in Ben Kungel's shrine room. And he saw him throw all this ash and all this dust on the altar. And then he turned to his own students and he said, at this moment in Tibet, Ben Kungel has made the most perfect offering. Right? So throwing ashes on the altar, you would think would be the worst offering that you could make. But because he knew that he was, it was an action of rectifying his motivation. It wasn't the objects that were a problem, it was the attitude towards the objects. And in this case, you were setting out a beautiful object just to impress someone, reputation. So Padampa Sangye praised Ben Kungel for making such a perfect offering. So the perfection of the offering wasn't in the quality of what was being offered, right? Because obviously dust isn't as nice as beautiful looking cloth, for example, right? But because it went directly to oppose the poisonous minds of greed, attachment, and ignorance, it was the most perfect offering. And one other little anecdote, maybe you heard how in the time of a previous Buddha, the Buddha of that age was approaching a certain village, a certain area, and there was a young boy there who was very, very affected by the sight of this enlightened being, and he developed great faith in him. And he didn't have anything to offer, but he wanted to offer something. So he dug into the ground and he picked up a pile of sand, just of sand or dirt, right? But he held it out, and as he did that, he visualized it as sand, not as sand, but as if they were diamonds, or grains of diamond. And so that's what he ended up actually offering, because he wasn't viewing it in an ordinary way. He was viewing it through the power of imagination, through transformation, another aspect of transformative practice. And he was seeing it in the most beautiful, attractive light possible, and not for himself, but out of sign of respect for the Buddha. And In later lifetimes, they pointed to the fact that it was this offering of this imagined pile of diamonds, which were actually, in ordinary reality, just sand, that created the cause for him to become one of the great practitioners and one of the great spiritual leaders of his own day. So this shows us that the value of something doesn't reside in the thing itself. Because what is the thing itself? The more you examine the thing itself, the less you find. Right? That's part of the emptiness teachings, isn't it? You look at something from a distance, it looks like a beautiful tree. You get closer and closer and closer, you don't even see the tree anymore. You just see veins and bark and things like that. And you look closer and then you just see atoms, molecules moving in space. So what you see from a distance is very different from what you see when you explore more closely. So what's important is what's in your own mind, the attitude in your own mind. So these sensory objects of desire are not evil or bad in and of themselves. They only become a problem when they're joined with the mind of greed, hatred, ignorance, and all of the other delusions. So if you can look at objects with an attitude of generosity, of giving, of transformation, then these objects present no problem. But if you see them under ordinary appearance, if that ordinary appearance is governed by karma and delusion, in other words, if it's a samsaric appearance, that's where the problem lies. Okay? So let me check the time. I can't see where my is. Okay. So we have a half hour left of this session, according to my watch. And I want to just look, John, maybe we can look at the first of the 4 pages that I sent to you, page A. And meantime, if there's anything that come up in your mind that you want to ask about or have further questions about, then I'll try to leave some space after a brief discussion of this towards the end. Okay, so is that pretty much in big enough font for everyone to see? I'll read it out loud if it isn't, okay? So on this, it says on the top, the title is The 7-Limb Prayer. 7-Limb Prayer. And the source of this 7-Limb Prayer is the King of Prayers. Are you people somewhat familiar with the King of Prayers? This is something that our teachers very often have us recite or suggest that we recite as part of a larger practice, the King of Prayers. Somewhat familiar? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay. Well, what I found interesting was I didn't know this originally, but the King of Prayers is actually an excerpt from one of the early Mahayana sutras. In fact, this sutra was so famous in the Far East, in places like China and Japan and Korea and so forth, that there's a whole school of Buddhism named after the sutra from which this comes. This King of Prayer is a short version of a sutra that's known as the Avatamsaka, or Flower Ornament Sutra. And if you look at that sutra, you'll find in it, and it's a very enormous, very long, very detailed sutra. But within it is this prayer of Samantabhadra. And it's from that that the 7-limb prayer comes. So, and in it, there is a listing of the 7 limbs of offering, 7 aspects of offering. And there are the 7 that are listed. So the first one is often simply called prostrations, or the equivalent is paying homage, or even sometimes just simply referred to as praise. So when you see something that is an object of your respect, you can show your respect by your attitude, by your physical attitude, like offering prostrations. And it doesn't have to be a full body prostration, just be simply pressing the palms together the way Avalokiteshvara does, the 2 central hands pressed together at the heart. That's a prostration, that's a homage. Or you can show it by reciting words of praise, or just thinking how wonderful, paying homage. So that's the first limb, is to orient ourselves to a truly worthwhile object. If you think in modern Western culture, what is it that people pay homage to? What do they bow down in front of? Well, unless they have a well-developed spiritual practice, they're likely to do it if they if they're walking down the street in New York City and a very famous personality suddenly appears and they're kind of overwhelmed by seeing this very famous person, they might intuitively bow in front of that person, right? Am I exaggerating when I say that, or is that really true? I do think it's true. Right? So people respect fame, they respect power, they respect money, and they prostrate in one of many different ways in front of someone who symbolizes that. Well, here we've just set up our altar or shrine room to do a meditation practice. So who are we inviting in to this place? Who do we want to show up as an object of our homage, of our object of our respect? Well, it's the gurus, the Buddhas, the bodhisattvas. Right? Why do we choose them rather than choose someone who's really rich or really famous or has been elected to a high office or something like that? Well, we know, unfortunately, that a lot of people who are rich and famous and powerful, actually, a lot of them aren't very nice people. Right? They're not people, they might be people who could help us temporarily by giving us some money or prestige, but they have no ability to enhance our own experience of deep, abiding happiness and well-being. Right? So who has that power? Who is it? Well, if depending on whatever spiritual practice we're oriented towards, it's the exemplar from that position. And that's true whether we're Buddhist or whether we belong to another spiritual practice. I'll use Buddhists as the example because this is a Buddhist group, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. Every spiritual tradition places forward some being or some image or some symbol which stands for all of the truly beneficial qualities of mind and heart that we wish to develop to enhance our experience of being alive in this world. So for Buddhist practitioners, this would be the great teachers, the great bodhisattvas, the great Buddhas themselves. So that's who we're inviting into our space, into the space where our where our altar or shrine is set up. And we're welcoming that person into that meditative space. We're welcoming that enlightened being into that meditative space by making it as welcoming and as attractive to their enlightened senses as we can imagine. Now, of course, from the side of the Buddhas, they don't need to be pleased by a beautiful setup. But it's our setting it up, which is a sign of the homage and respect we have for them. It's that attitude which is respectful, not the objects themselves. The Buddhists don't care. They don't need, after the meditation session is finished, and the Buddhists don't come together and say, "Oh, you should look at the beautiful flowers that this guy gave me. Oh, look at the ugly weeds this person gave me." They don't think about that. It doesn't make any difference to them. But if they recognize that someone is making this offering out of respect for what the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas represent in terms of spiritual evolution, then this, of course, is very pleasing. And I remember the word puja, which is used in Hinduism and Buddhism for an offerings ceremony. I remember being taught in quite an early day that the puja doesn't, that word itself apparently doesn't actually mean offering. What it means is that which pleases, that which is pleasing, right? And so the true offering, well, I'll ask this as a question. What offering could you imagine making if you have a guru, to your guru, or if you have a bodhisattva or a yidam that you particularly feel connected with, or what offering could you make to any of the various Buddhas like Shakyamuni or Amitabha? What kind of offering could you make, do you think would be the most pleasing to these beings? From your own experience, if you could offer anything, what would be the greatest offering that you could make? Meaning the one that would please them the most, because puja means pleasing. So what do the Buddhists find most pleasing? You know,
Our practice.
exactly, our practice, right? If someone was actually, for instance, like Ben Kungel, throwing ashes in the face of these 8 worldly concerns is an incredible practice. So that's the most pleasing, even though from an exterior point of view, he actually made the room look quite sloppy. But anyone with insight could realize what he was actually doing was combating the delusions. And that's what practice is all about, combating the delusions, the greed, the ignorance, the jealousy, and so forth. Okay. So when we set up an altar and do these 7 limbs, each of them stands for a certain aspect of the practice that we want to engage in relationship to the holy beings, the gurus, the Buddhas, the bodhisattvas that we're inviting into our meditative space. And so each part of the practice relates to enhancing our relationship to these superior objects, to these objects of our ultimate practice. The ability to overcome karma and delusion and gain all the insights along the spiritual path, and eventually leading ourselves to higher rebirth, liberation, and enlightenment. That's the true meaning of puja. And each of these 7 sections enhances an aspect of the path. So we'll have to take more time next week to kind of pinpoint what each of them refers to. But for now, we have a chance to look at look at the 7 in a kind of a cursory fashion, just to get an overview. So it starts out with prostration and paying homage. So that puts ourselves in a conducive attitude, a respectful position to the guru. And actually, instead of my constantly repeating the gurus, the bodhisattvas, and the Buddhas, I'll just say the guru, right? Because the guru is the embodiment of the 3 jewels of refuge, as Kebje Lama Zopa Rinpoche never tired of explaining. Right? So if we just refer to the objects as the gurus or the guru Buddhas, then that's a shorthand version for the quality of enlightenment. And the deeper and deeper we get into it, the more expansive our understanding of what the guru is. Because if we think of the man or the woman who we relate to as being our guru, that's only one aspect. That's only an exterior aspect. You know, the actual guru is the enlightened quality, the so-called Dharmakaya, possessed by all enlightened beings, ultimately becoming one with our own potentially enlightened nature. So the guru that we have a picture of on the altar, let's say if there's a man, you know, a Tibetan Lama, let's say. Okay. So he's the relative guru, but the actual guru is beyond that, isn't it? I mean, we're not taking a refuge in, you know, how handsome he looks, you know, or how well dressed he appears. It's not that. It's some inner quality of mind, right? The ability to be beneficial. And that is the Dharmakaya mind of all enlightened beings. And so that's the ultimate guru, who's no different from our own potentially enlightened mind itself. So if we use the term guru, we shouldn't think that we're just reducing it to one human being who maybe is Tibetan or Western or something like that. That's a sign of the ultimate guru. Okay. And then the practice of offerings, the second limb, of course, is the way that we're inviting this enlightened being into our presence. And it's a sign of the respect that we have for him or her. Mm-hmm. The refuge that we take in the Dharmakaya mind of all enlightened beings. Then the third one is, I've written it here as declaration, declaring one's shortcomings. In some translations, there is another term that's used here, which is equivalent to a term. It's actually a term which comes from Roman Catholicism. What's that term? Does anyone know? I saw some lips moving, but I didn't hear anything.
Confession.
Confession, right. So a lot of times this third limb is called the limb of confession. The actual term, I've been told, in Tibetan is not so much confession, it's exposing. In other words, if we have created something negative in the past, the more we keep it tight and closed, the more we refrain from exposing it, the more it rankles, the more it prevents us from getting rid of it, from overcoming it. So one of the important ways of getting over a negativity is just to declare it, to open it up, right? Not not in the sense of how proud I am because I told this great lie, just recognizing, oh, I did or said something which was negative, and before it produces its suffering effect, as it inevitably will, uh, I must get rid of it. And the first step in getting rid of it is simply acknowledge that we did something wrong, with an attitude of regret. Now, this is a little bit tricky for many of us Westerners because we can easily fall into the trap of guilt. And if we practice this third limb of declaration or confession with a guilty attitude, it won't work. It won't work. Because when we have the guilty attitude towards it, we fundamentally think that on some deep level of our being, we're rotten. We're a bad person. We're a guilty person. And a lot of Westerners fall into that. And probably by now that attitude has spread around the world. But there was a time where it was found more predominantly within Western-oriented cultures than in Eastern. But I think those days may have changed by now. So if guilt is not the right attitude to do this third limb of practice of declaring, what would be the right attitude? There is an equivalent, a rough equivalent to guilt, which has none of the negative connotations. And if you ever receive teachings on the 4 opponent powers, like if you're doing a purification practice, like Vajrasattva, then for that practice to work, you have to apply the 4 opponent powers. And one of those opponent powers is exactly what we're looking for here when we're practicing the declaration or the confession of non-virtue. Does anybody know what that might be?
It's regret.
Regret. Regret. Regret is just an honest appraisal that something that we did was wrong, or something that we did is going to lead to a negative result. And since we don't want that result, we want to purify it. We want to get rid of it. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It just means we did something wrong. You know, just an honest acknowledgement of it. The next power, the last one I'll talk about today, is rejoicing. And I love the way rejoicing immediately follows declaration, because declaration or confession can lead to this kind of guilty feeling, you know, especially if we, in our meditation, we go through all the mistakes that we made in our life, or even all the mistakes we made in the last week, you know. And if we really think about it, we can really end up being very hard on ourselves. So what balances that out is also recognizing all the things that we and everyone else have done that we can rejoice in, right? Because we're not just rejoicing in the attitudes of the gurus, the Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. We're also rejoicing in any of the things that we ourselves have done, which are positive and counterbalance any of the negativities that we declared when we were engaged in the third of the 7 limbs. Okay. Well, let's see. So I think from my side, that's enough for today. And when we come back in the next weeks, then I'll continue on this. And there's more of this, there's more pages of this outline that we can go over. But maybe now something has come up during this hour and a half that we've been together that you'd like to comment on or ask questions about, this would be an excellent time to do so. But just make sure that you indicate who you are, so one of us can see you and call you to the fore.
John,
Yes.
if you have a dream in which in the dream, you committed an error or a negative thing, but you haven't done it in real life, but it's just, you did it in your dream. Is that something that you should declare and confess?
There might be different answers to that question, but from my point of view, I think this is something to acknowledge, because it is something that arose in your mind. Let's say, let's give a specific action. Let's say in the dream you killed someone. Make it really extreme. You killed someone. You know.
Right.
Now, you definitely did not create the karma of killing someone, because it was just a dream person. It wasn't a real person. So you shouldn't feel guilty as if you just actually did kill someone, right? You don't have to purify that, because you didn't do that action. But it must have come from a mental attitude of aggression, you know, a kind of a hateful, destructive state of mind. You know? So even though it's not a full karmic action, it is a sign, or can be a sign, that this kind of negative energy is still present in the mind. It doesn't always have to be that way. There were stories told by, you know, like the great meditator Milarepa had his own disciples, and on certain occasions, he would meet with, you know, 2 or 3 of his disciples, and he would ask them to tell him their dreams. And sometimes the person who was telling a dream was very ashamed, because in the dream he was killing people and doing all these really negative things, and he thought, oh, I have to tell Milarepa that's what I was dreaming, but I'm not proud of that. You know, I'm kind of ashamed of that. But Milarepa was able to see from his perspective, that in fact, for that particular person, that was actually an expiation of a sin. In other words, it was a sign that a certain negativity had been overcome, that what was being killed was like overcoming a delusion.
Oh,
So sometimes it's hard to interpret your dream unless you really do have a very, very deep insight. But let's say if it's just an ordinary dream, it's not the dream of someone who's a high level disciple of a great being like Milarepa, right? So if in that dream something negative comes up, it could simply be the purification of something. In other words, you're just getting rid of something, and you can rejoice in that. But it also might be a sign of some unresolved anxiety or hatred, right? So then it would be a very, very good idea to, like in that case, like may my experience of the hatred and the killing in this dream be enough to exhaust it for anyone else who has a similar mental disposition. So you use the experience of the dream to purify whatever needs to be purified.
thank you.
But I'm sure if you were to ask this question from a real practitioner, they would be able to give you more in-depth answer than that. But if it's something that's happening in a dream, well, that dream comes from some place, and in most cases, it's something within one's own psyche. So it might be something that is a sign, something that requires further purification.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. 5 or 6 more minutes. Is there any other questions? Yes.
Did you say further purification?
Did I say further purification?
Yes, that it's possible that it would be asking for further purification. I thought that's what I heard you say, but I wasn't sure. And I was wondering if so, then would that be like a Vajrasattva prayers, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Exactly. Many great practitioners from the past and up to the present, the moment even a slightly negative thought arises in their mind, they've not done anything yet, right?
Mhm.
But they get a certain, nasty attitude, some kind of pops up. The minute it does, they haven't expressed it yet. It just pops
Mhm.
up. The minute they do that, Vajrasattva's mantra's on their lips. Om Vajrasattva Samaya Manapuri Vajrasattva Tena Patita. In other words, they're so familiar with the process of recognizing a negativity and then combating it through a purification practice like Vajrasattva, but there's many other practices as well, that the moment that they see a negativity arising in their mind, even before they've had a chance to actually put into action, they're already applying the antidote.
Mhm.
And that's something which is, there's that famous teaching, the 8-point verse training of the mind, those 8 very short stanzas that all our teachers are constantly teaching. One of those, I forget which number it is the moment a negativity arises, avert it without delay. And one of the ways of averting it is recognize it, purifying it, like that. Such as with Vajrasattva.
Thank you. That's helpful. Yes.
Thank you. And
Question on the same subject of purification. Do you say the full Vajrasattva mantra or the short one to purify on the spot?
that's a very practical question. If I have a time and space, I do the 100-syllable mantra. But if it's something that's arising like that, it's Om Vajrasattva Hum.
Because it's very simple, the short one.
Yeah, then it's just, I think that's only 6 syllables. It's
And you
very, very
don't have to, and you don't go through the 4 opponent powers.
But these practices become more powerful the more you've been doing the 4 opponent powers. You've been doing it
Yeah,
over the days, months, and years of your life. So you don't have to actually stop and do now the first one, now the second one, now the third one. Your mind can go through them very rapidly
okay,
because you're so familiar with them. So you actually are applying all 4 opponent powers. But in the beginning, when we're new people, it can take quite a while to go through
yeah,
each
yeah,
of
it
the 4.
does.
But after
It
a
does.
while, they can become very quick. But it's always good. I mean, I know this for myself. Any practice that I do repeatedly eventually becomes rote and becomes kind of meaningless. So periodically, it's very important to refresh your practice that maybe has grown too predictable or too stale.
Sure.
But while it's still alive in our mind, we can apply those 4 opponent powers very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anything else you'd like to bring up or ask or may comment about? Or maybe this is not a question that you can answer right now, but if you wish to send an email to me with an answer to this question, do you have any suggestions of the direction you would like these sessions to take? Because I try to put together what I myself find interesting. That may not necessarily accord with your wishes or your desires. So if there's anything that comes up that you feel, well, this would be a good thing to explore, this would be beneficial. If I had psychic powers, I could read your mind. But since I don't have any psychic powers at all, getting an email from you with those suggestions would be very, very helpful. Yes.
Do we have 1 or 2 sessions left?
Had to add one for the one that I completely missed, right? And that was going to be January. No, not January.
June.
The first one in June.
Yes,
That was going to be added to it.
okay.
So, but I've lost track. Eloise, can you help me on that?
Yeah, I think we just have one more, and that's the next week, which is the 1st of June.
I have to double check. I'm pretty sure that date is okay for me. But I will double check because a number of things changed recently, especially in relationship to all the events that were taking place at the end of May because of the passing of Kebje Zopa Rinpoche and all those practices. That of course took precedence over a lot of things. So it might have turned out that last added day doesn't work for me. At the moment, I think it does, but I will check and make sure. And if I discover that additional Thursday doesn't work, I will let John and Eloise know, and they'll let everybody else know. But why don't we assume that Thursday will work, and if it isn't, then we'll spread the word. But I don't know how all the hundreds of other people who like to come to this meeting, how they'll find out about it. It'll only be the 6 of you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Anyway, anything you'd like to say at the end before we depart?
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience.
Appreciate your
Thank you.
sharing
Thank
your
you, John.
experience and your knowledge.
There's been any value in any of the things that we've done or said here, even the things that haven't been said out loud, but the kind of thoughts that came up in our mind when we were trying to make sense or deepen our understanding about the topics that have come up. If any of these have been beneficial, leading to further understanding, may it be dedicated so that all beings may be released from their mental and physical sufferings and samsara, and that the lives of all our holy beings may increase for greater scope for their enlightening activities. And of course, at this time, especially, that it may be directed for the swift return of our Varja Guru, Kebje Lama Tupten Zopa Rinpoche, so that his incarnation is recognized correctly and is able to continue his enlightening activities on behalf of all beings. And so that in the future, may we continue to be disciples of such extraordinary teachers as Kebje Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Okay.
Thank you,
So,
John.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Thank you very much,
Mary.
Don. We
Very much.
certainly hope to see you next week.
Yes,
Yes.
Yes. Good night.
good night.
Night.